Rebus Oltha, dwarf. Once Leith was all caught up, we began celebrating our newfound partnership. We drank our drinks and ordered some more food, and the humans' party joined us and was kind enough to pay. Once everyone was done making a fuss over Nick's dietary needs, Mako and the other orcs got to chatting. Their talk was mostly about the unified chiefdoms, which might interest someone who loves to travel. Travelin' is my least favorite part of being a hunter, though. Sitting in a cart or on a narse all damn day just to go to some place that people are gonna look at you funny? Fuck that. My attention turned from the orcs, and I started listening to Hino, Liath, and Galli instead. But then they began talking about the political happenings in the Empire, an even more boring conversation than the one I had tuned out. I switched my focus to the slightly more interesting discussion that Ithrima and Nick were having. The start of their conversation made me grin. Hino and Galli are both level 13, I am level 12, and Mako is level 15. It wasn't surprising to hear that Nick's party was comprised of under 10s, except for Olmyra, who doesn't have a level. What I found funny, though, is that Ithrima and Nick are almost the same level. She's only level 9, and has been stuck at level 9 for over a year now. Everyone else in the party is an over 10? Olmyra asked. Yes, I would be too, but I specialize, Ithrima answered hastily. My interest lies in attack magic, fire, ice, and darkness to be precise. The only non-offensive spell I know is minor healing, and that's only because I'd be out of a job without it. Damn right. We don't have any use for a mage that can't heal, I laughed. How many spells do you know? Nick asked. 8 attack spells, but they're more powerful than you'll find from most mages. My magic core is just about average, but I'm able to make my spells more intense thanks to my studies and training. That's awesome, Nick beamed. I only know 7 spells, but only 4 of them are attack spells. I couldn't help but laugh harder. Ithrima is pretty pretentious about her magic, so this conversation has got to be needling her a bit. Of course, there's always room for more needling. He knows almost as many spells as you do, I said. Say, Nick, if the whole getting home thing doesn't work out, shut your damned mouth, Ithrima growled. I'm under contract, you can't replace me even if you wanted to. I gave an evil chuckle and took a bite of my bell popper. The chefs had really outdone themselves. Bell poppers take careful preparation because the seeds pop when directly exposed to water. Since the plant already has water in it, you've got to be really careful while cooking it to prevent the seeds from prematurely popping. Each seed is filled with a sweet powder that's often used to sweeten other food items. The rest of the bell popper has a slightly bitter taste to it, so eating the whole plant turns into one hell of a culinary experience. It's one of my favorite foods. As I ate, the ladies explained how the impact of an attack spell is based on both the expertise and the amount of magic behind the spell. Essentially, a dumbass with a lot of magic can lob a fireball that's as intense as a smartass that only has a little magic. I chuckled again and asked if Ithrima was sure she had an average amount of magic. Before she could react, Mako cracked his neck and patted his pants. This has been great, but I'm getting tired. We're setting out tomorrow, right? He asked. As soon as possible would be ideal, Yulk said, unless we have a reason to stall. We all looked at each other, but nobody could think of anything. Our equipment was well maintained because we hadn't really used it, and it wouldn't take long to pick up the supplies needed for the hike. We all agreed that tomorrow would be the day of our raid and left the Venators Guild. We walked together until we reached our respective destinations, which happened to be across the street from each other. The inn that we were staying at wasn't exactly the worst place you could stay in this town, but they were staying at the Marfix Inn. It wasn't that surprising considering how quickly Nick had dropped 10 gold earlier, but I still felt a pang of jealousy. The Marfix Inns are well known for their extravagance and luxuries. Massages, professional chefs, climate control, super soft beds with even softer bedding, and even hot water were standard in every inn. I'd always wanted to stay in one, just to see what it's like to be pampered like that. Unfortunately, even their cheapest rooms run a whole gold piece per night. It's hard to justify that kind of expense when you might need to pay for equipment repairs. Even 50 silver would be a lot just to stay the night. Our inn only cost 20 copper per room per night, and we doubled up to save some money. Except for Ithrima, of course. She always played the female card to avoid having to share a room with any of us. I gave an exaggerated sigh as I watched Nick's party enter the Marfix Inn. Then I turned to look at Gally with pupper eyes. Absolutely not, he said. But we have 10 gold, I argued. It won't cost more than 5. He's right, Mako said with a lot less investment than me. If we double up, it would only be 3 gold. Yeah, 3 gold that will be sorely missed if we end up ruining our equipment tomorrow, Gally scoffed. Plus, we already paid for our rooms here. They don't give refunds, you know. Who cares? I asked. It's only a few copper. We could be dead tomorrow, Gally. We should live a little. I'd rather be dead than destitute. Oh, come on, it's not that bad. We'll still have 7 gold, and that'll be enough to replace most of our equipment. Plus, if we're successful with the vampire hunt, we'll qualify for better-paying hunts. And what if we're not successful? Then we'll be dead and won't have to worry about it. I could tell that Ithrima and Mako were fully with me on this. Hino was being pretty aloof, but there's a good chance he'd vote my way if I called for one. But calling for a vote here would undermine Gally's leadership. Hino, Mako, and I had previously spoken at length about who should be our next leader, and we'd settled on Gally. His even temperament and innate situational awareness would make him a great leader, but he's humble enough to decline the position if we tried to make it official. So naturally, we were trying our best to put him in that position without him realizing it. Wait a fucking minute. Why am I the one making this decision? He demanded, displaying his innate situational awareness. 'Cause you're the one carrying the money, I answered quickly. And I don't want you to ruin our stay by bitching about how we aren't being miserly the whole damn time. As if I'd... Gods above and below, grant me patience. Fucking fine. We can stay at the Marfix, but I still reserve the right to bitch the whole time. Once I finished jumping for joy, we got our stuff from the inn and explained our decision to the very understanding innkeeper. Then we went across the street to check into the Marfix. I tried to play it cool when we went inside, but the sheer wealth on display made my jaw drop. It's common to see gold trim in Calcutan buildings. It's not common for that trim to have gems embedded in it, though. On top of that, in the center of the lobby was a multi-level golden fountain with water gushing out of the largest blue sapphire I'd ever seen. It struck me that 3 gold would be a bargain to stay in a place like this. We got a raised eyebrow from the front desk clerk, but other than that, he was very polite and professional. There was a small argument over who the kobold would be bunking with, but Ithrima finally folded when faced with the prospect of having to share a room with one of us. We surrendered the 3 gold, deposited our stuff in our rooms, and set off to enjoy the amenities. The first thing I did was visit the spa. I got a nice mud bath and warm rinse, then went to the sauna where I ran into Nick and Nash. "Hi, guys," I said cheerily as I sat down across from them. "Pretty hot in here, isn't it?" "Nah, it's just right," Nash said gruffly. "Yep, not too hot at all." Nick wiped the sweat from his forehead. I grinned as I realized what I had walked in on. A tough guy competition was in full swing. I let out a sigh as I leaned back against the wall, knowing that I had the advantage because I had just walked in. "You're right, this is pretty nice," I said. We sat in silence for a time, allowing the heat to slowly bake us alive. Eventually, the last glimmers of sunset shining through the sauna's only window began to fade. Once the glow was gone completely and night finally settled, Nick cleared his throat and stood up. "While this heat is enjoyable, I think we should be going to bed now," he said with an air of diplomacy. "We have a long day ahead of us, and we'll need our sleep." Nash and I looked at each other. On the one hand, the human's suggestion could be considered a sign of weakness, which would allow us to poke fun at him. On the other hand, he had a damn good point, and poking fun at him would result in us having to stay in the sauna longer to prove we weren't as weak as him. I grinned when I realized that Nash was also considering the fact that I had joined them late and had quite an advantage in this contest. "He's right," Nash said, standing. "We'll be heading to bed." "You?" "I might as well," I sighed. I followed Nick and Nash out of the sauna and chose a shower stall to rinse off. The cold water was an extreme contrast to the heat of the sauna, and I had to struggle to maintain my composure. Once we were finished, we nodded to each other and went to our rooms. Hino's snores greeted me as I entered the room. He had somehow managed to clean his gear, and it was currently laying neatly next to his bed. My own gear had carried the scent of kobold corpses out of the dungeon, so I'd left it for the launders. I disrobed, laid in bed, and tried unsuccessfully to fall asleep. At first, I blamed Hino's snoring. That didn't really hold up for long, though, because Mako's snoring is much louder. Once you sleep through that mountain of an orc's snores, you can sleep through anything. My thoughts turned toward tomorrow, and I realized that the reason I couldn't sleep was due to nerves. Vampires are one of the most fearsome opponents a hunter or adventurer can run into. They're smart, fast, and unnaturally strong. Plus, they can turn you into one of them. Even most legendary weapons can't do lasting damage to them, and all I have is a relatively cheap orc-made steel sword. It does the job against most other beasties, but stabbing a vampire will just piss it off. I don't even know how well my shield's gonna hold up against their claws. With a sigh, I rose from my bed. There's only one cure for nervous insomnia, and that's exhaustion. I remembered seeing a sign for a training area, so I decided that some exercise would do me good. Thankfully, it didn't take long to find the sign and follow its arrow. When I opened the door, I was met with the sound of wood smacking against a training dummy. I turned to find Nick practicing with a wooden sword. "Hey, Nick," I said as he turned to look at me. "Having trouble sleeping?" "Yeah," he replied, fidgeting with the practice weapon. I thought I should get some training in. Need to be in peak form tomorrow." "Same here." I grabbed a wooden sword and shield and picked a dummy. Nick watched me strike at the dummy's neck for a bit, then left without saying another word. I watched the door close behind him, shrugging off the paranoia that came with that awkward interaction. It was definitely strange, though. I could swear his voice had sounded different. Nick Smith, human. Once we finished our lovely breakfast and checked our gear, we began our hike to the dungeon. Leith stayed behind, claiming to be useless in both fighting and long walks. He acted pained when nobody argued with him. The hike itself didn't seem that difficult at first, but my body felt heavy for some reason. I had slept fine, but still had to stifle more than a few yawns as we walked. In contrast to my fatigue, the kobolds seemed to get more and more excited as we approached the dungeon. "We get rid of the suckers, then you can meet the Lord," the kobold said excitedly. "He's going to be so happy." "Who is your Lord, exactly?" Nash asked. "The Lord is the Lord." It tilted its head in confusion. "Knows lots of magics, speaks in heads, can't die." We stopped marching and all of us stared at the kobold with blank expressions. Nothing was coming to mind based on that description, but something that knows a lot of magic and speaks telepathically doesn't sound great. Not to mention that kobolds seem to worship it. Yulk gently cleared his throat. "Kobold, does your master have any skin?" he asked. Yeah, I think." "Wait, yeah, he does," the kobold said excitedly, then paused and rubbed its chin. "Doesn't wear it a lot, though." "Sounds like a lich," Gally said nervously. "Dunno that word. What's a lich?" "One of the greatest crimes against nature ever committed by a mortal," Mako explained sternly. "Arrogance and ambition culminating in a being of pure evil and spite." "Too many don't know words," the kobold crossed its arms angrily. "But the Lord isn't evil. He helps kobolds a lot. Nobody else helps kobolds. Shitty people think we're trash. Farmy people think we're a new sense. But the Lord teaches us new stuff, heals us when we get hurts, and even tells us when we do good jobs. The Lord never hurts kobolds. So from my presp, so me thinks that shitty people be way more evil than the Lord." "Well, perhaps your Lord isn't a lich," Mako said. "Or maybe he's a lich that likes kobolds. I suppose we'll find out." "How did you and your Lord survive the vampires?" I asked as we continued our trek. "I was sick when they came in. The Lord said me ate the wrong kind of swimmer," he explained. "The sucker didn't push the secret rock, so I didn't get to die for the Lord, and the sucker captured him." "Why didn't the vampire kill your Lord?" "I already said. The Lord can't die. One time we thought he did when some of the ceiling fell, and we were super sad about it. Then he came back 3 days later, and was mad because we'd stopped working and made a big mess. He didn't hit us, though, which was nice, Most lords are smack happy, but that's not condu, good for a good workplace. Conducive to a good work environment? I offered helpfully. Yeah, not conducive to a good work environmental. Instead of smacks, he made us apologize and clean up after ourselves. Then he gave head pats, ear scratches, and fish with bread. Really good bread, too, no green stuff on it. Well, coming back from the dead is a big indicator that this guy's a lich, Gally said. Kobold, how do we know that your lord isn't going to attack us once we defeat the vampires? 'Cause he's not gonna. The lord doesn't hurt helpers. We stared at the kobold, expecting him to elaborate further. He stared right back at us, seemingly confused by our hesitation. After a few moments, Gally sighed in exasperation. Fine, let's go, he said as he turned. Wait, I interrupted. What's your name? Me? The kobold asked. Yeah. Simith is what me is called. Don't mind being called kobold, though. You don't? Gally asked. Nah. Reminds me that I'm the last, which also means that I'm the best. Sure, Gally said as we continued on. You're the best by default, why not? You can't count past 7, though? Mako asked with a grin. I would think that the best kobold would be able to count to 10. I don't know what comes after 7, Samith sighed. 8, I added, trying to be helpful. 8 what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Who's 9 and 10? Why did 7 eat them? How do numbers eat things? Samith sighed louder. I have had these questions for so long and nobody ever answers. The realization that the kobold was caught up on a pun made me hesitate. Wait, did you translate that right? I asked 10. Yes. How is that pun in more than one language? I am an artificial intelligence, not an etymologist. What does studying bugs have to do with anything? No, that's entomologist. Etymology is the study of words and their histories. Shit, I grumbled to myself. There it is, Gally said. That's the entrance. We stopped in front of a mausoleum that was made entirely of polished tan brown stone. It reminded me of my grandma's counters, which were made of fake granite. The mausoleum had 2 columns on each side of its entrance, which was lacking any sort of door. The sun made it impossible to see past the entrance, though, as if the mausoleum had a door of darkness protecting whatever was inside it. Above the entrance was a carving that depicted 2 winged beings kneeling to a skull. At first glance, I thought they were angels. Closer inspection revealed them to be armored elves. The skull didn't have any pointed teeth, so it was probably elven too. Oh, I get it now, Mako said. Right. The skull is because of the lich, Rebus added. Makes sense. How does that make sense? Ithrima asked. Surely this dungeon is older than the lich. How do you figure? Hino countered. Well, the monsters within the dungeon were spewing out of it at some point, right? Ithrima looked around for assurance. Am I the only one who thought that implied that someone stopped the monsters? Like the lich and kobolds? There were baddies before the Lord, Seameath added helpfully. The Lord said that they were making the shitty people come, so he killed them all. My daddy helped. So how can the skull be referring to the lich? Ithrima demanded smugly. It's obviously not native to this dungeon. Gods grant me patience, Rebus sighed. Why are you thinking this carving was always like this? Liches are as magical as they are megalomaniacal, so why in the hells wouldn't he change the carving to suit himself? We gonna argue, or are we gonna get to work? Nash asked. We're burning daylight. Like that matters, Rebus laughed. It's darker than the crack of my ass in there. We'll have to walk back, unless you plan on camping in the dungeon? A nasty smell wafted from the dungeon as if to prove Nash's point. Mako chuckled as Rebus sighed. Fine, let's go. Yulk, Ithrima, and Olmyra, you'll be in the back with Gally and the kobold. Nash and Nick are in the center, supporting whoever needs it. Mako, Hino, and I will be front, Rebus said. Remember, the goal is to stop their movement and whoosh them. Won't the fire make breathing a problem? I asked. A light wind spear should help with that, Yulk said. I'll do it. Don't want the tunnel collapsing. Yulk winked at me as everyone else prepared their gear. Rebus and Hino strapped on their shields and unsheathed their swords. Nash hefted his axe while Mako examined his pike. Gally played with the string on his bow. Trying not to look as nervous as I felt, I drew my sword. There's a lot of dead kobolds in there, so mind the stench, Gally said. Let's go. I trailed behind Nash as we entered the dungeon. As soon as I entered, the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood rigid. The air was filled with the stench of death and a sense of dread. Stifling my instinctual urge to panic, I cast light. Everyone else activated their lights too, and we began our grim march down the hallway. Careful, traps, Mako said. The big orc began lightly pushing his pike on the tiled floor until we all heard a click. A moment later, a grate with spikes fell from the ceiling. Nash let out a low whistle as the trap receded. Not the usual fare for dungeon traps, he said. It is around these parts, Mako replied solemnly. Calcutan dungeons are much more dangerous than the dungeons in the chiefdoms, and it isn't because of the monsters. I see. The traps have been here since I was born, Samith said. Can avoid by just stepping around them. We don't know where they are, Mako countered. Me help. Samith's feet pattered against the tile, and his wagging tail grazed my leg as he ran past me. He also ran past Nash, but Mako stopped him with a massive hand. The tiny kobold looked at the massive orc with obvious confusion. If you're in front, you'll be the first target for a vampire, Mako explained. How about you ride on my shoulders and point out the traps instead? When we see a vampire, you can hop down. That's a long way up, Seameath replied. Dunno if I can jump down from there. I'll help you get down, Nash said. Seameath looked back and forth between Mako and Nash, then shrugged. Okay. Hino smiled and Rebus chuckled as the kobold, who was noticeably shorter than the dwarves, climbed Mako Mountain. Mako helped the little lizard up, and Seameath sat with his legs on either side of Mako's neck. It reminded me of my cousin with his kid. We continued on until we found the first kobold corpses. The rank stench in the air threatened to make me puke. I held my nose as we pushed past, but breathing through my mouth didn't help at all. Seameath pointed out another trap, and we slipped past it. Then we ran into more dead kobolds. This pattern repeated itself a few more times before Seameath sighed and pointed to one of the kobold corpses. That's my daddy. If I didn't get sick, I'd have been right next to him. Maybe have made a difference, but the Lord said I wouldn't have. Guess the Lord knows best. Do you want to say goodbye? Mako asked. For why? He's dead. Seameath tilted his head. Can't hear when you're dead, right? I suppose not, Mako said glumly. Hey, Seameath, how old are you? I asked. I'm 3 years old, the reptilian grinned. Almost a grown-up. I almost told Seameath my age, then realized his response would probably be questions about who's een and why did you eat them. Instead, I turned my attention to Rebus, who let out a low whistle. That explains so much, the dwarf chuckled and shook his head. When do kobolds become adults? I don't know, Seameath replied with a shrug. Let's keep moving, Mako interrupted. Actually, it would be best if you stopped, Seameath said with an odd tone and a vacant expression. The vampires know you're here. 2 of them have come to greet you. Prepare yourselves, hunters. The fuck? Rebus asked. There's very little time before they reach you. I am the being this one calls Lord, speaking to you through my only remaining vassal. Get ready, they come. Mako knelt a little, and Nash grabbed Seameath from his shoulders. We began to hear the soft thuds of footsteps just as we prepared our weapons. Rebus and Hino prepared their shields, and Mako hefted his pike. Nash and I took position behind the 3, ready to intercept any vampires that got through. Gally cocked his bow as Ithrima, Yulk, and Olmyra prepared to cast their spells. Seameath looked up at us and shook his head in confusion. What happening? He asked. The vampires are coming, I said. Get behind me. Seameath stared for a moment, then scampered toward the rear of our formation. We waited as the footsteps grew louder, prepared to see vampires leaping out of the shadows toward us. Then the footsteps stopped. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them watching us. Like the creeping feeling of panic when your nightlight goes out as a child. When you just know there's something in your closet and under your bed. When you get older, you're able to tell yourself that you're imagining it and that there's nothing there. But this time, it's not my imagination. Really? Rebus asked. You just gonna watch us? The big bad vampires are too scared to have a real fight? A pair of pale dwarves stepped out of the darkness. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their fingers ended in pointed claws. Cruel, fanged grins were plastered on their pasty faces. "We're not the ones who should be scared," one of them said. I almost couldn't follow its movements. The moment it finished speaking, it rushed toward Rebus. The other vampire rushed toward Mako. Moving just as quickly, Hino stepped in front of Mako as the orc's pike stabbed the vampire that was after Rebus. Mako hefted his pike upwards with the vampire skewered upon it, as Hino's sword flashed briefly in the light. The vampire slammed into the ground in front of me, and we made brief eye contact as Nash's axe fell. The heads of both vampires rolled in opposite directions on the floor. "Quick, pile 'em up," Gali said. "Gotta burn 'em." I stopped the vampire's head with my boot, and a wave of nausea smashed against my gut. Fighting it, I picked up the head by its hair and tossed it onto the body that it had been attached to. Hino and Mako tossed the pieces of the other vampire on the pile. I swallowed heavily and held up my hand. Labarif Zak! Intense heat flew from my hand and enveloped the pile of vampire parts. Eerie screeching and the smell of burnt meat filled the air. The knot in my stomach twisted further as I watched the bodies convulse. That's what it would look like if Rebis, Hino, or Gali. Unable to fight it any longer, I turned away from my party and spewed my breakfast onto the tiled floor. "Well, that was easier than I thought it would be," Rebis said, tactfully ignoring my display. "Let us hope it remains that way," Mako said coldly. "Why the human puke?" Samith asked. "Did he eat a bad swimmer?